Hello and welcome to the Crux of MedTech. We go beyond the buzzwords, bringing you the insights from the innovators, investors, and leaders who are driving this life-saving space forward. Because I'm absolutely fascinated by the stories that people have to tell in MedTech. As someone who works in this sector on a daily basis, I come across so many interesting people and so many interesting stories that I think the world deserves to know about. Welcome to the Crux of MedTech.
Hello, Rob, and welcome to the Crux of MedTech podcast.
Thank you, Henry. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
There's no problem in that at all. So, as we always do, we want to get a bit of a flavour for who you are, Robert, and basically where you've come from. So, let's start at the beginning. Like, where did you grow up, and tell us a bit about your early life.
Great. Well, I grew up just outside of New York City on the North Shore of Long Island in a town called Great Neck, where I lived with my family through graduation from high school. I was a lacrosse player in high school. It was much bigger on the East Coast than it has been here in the Midwest. But that's a sport I really enjoyed. I ended up coaching my daughter's middle school lacrosse team here in Minnesota, which was a lot of fun. The advantage there is most of the parents had no idea about the rules of the game or strategy, and so all they were focused on was their equal playing time for the children. And so I didn't get a lot of criticism, from the sidelines as a result. But anyway, I ended up I did all of my undergraduate and graduate education at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. So I was a natural science major, and I ended up completing a dual degree program where I got a doctorate in veterinary medicine and a PhD in physiology. It was essentially an MD PhD program, but I did my clinical degree in veterinary medicine instead of human medicine. And that has served me well, although I haven't been in practice most of my career. That broad education really has served me well, and during my career has allowed me to get into new therapeutic areas, new disease states, and come up to speed pretty quickly, helping with investor due diligence and things of that nature. So I really rely on my training, a lot, even though I'm not practicing, at this point. I also had the good fortune of meeting my wife of 35 years now, while in veterinary school in Philadelphia. And she was probably the main reason why we moved from actually Baltimore at the time where I was doing my postdoctoral work to Minneapolis. So her family's here. We moved back here to start our family. And I moved from, an academic career to a career in industry, where I began as a clinical research scientist and later a medical director at Medtronic. And that's really where my 30 plus years in the medical device industry really got started.
Awesome. So that dual degree, the physiology part was also animal physiology, or was that human physiology?
At that level, it's essentially the same. It's really human physiology. My PhD thesis was about mechanisms of cardiac arrhythmias, for which we did, preclinical research, but it was really with an eye toward improving our understanding of human cardiac arrhythmias and how to manage them.
Got you. So when you moved to Medtronic, what division were you in there? How did you start in Medtronic? What were the key projects you were assigned to?
So it was really interesting. I was in a corporate venture it was really a business unit venture looking at new applications of pacemakers and pacing related technologies. And we were looking for unmet need areas and identified heart failure and atrial fibrillation as two major unmet needs. And so our group was asked to focus on heart failure. So we became Medtronic's initial heart failure management organization. And then a separate business unit was set up to pursue the atrial fibrillation indication. And I worked on active implantable stimulation-based therapies for reduced ejection fraction heart failure, the early days of cardiac resynchronization therapy, implantable hemodynamic monitoring for heart failure and what became the Reveal insertable loop recorder for cardiac rhythm monitoring as well. So those were the major product areas that I worked on, and I ultimately became the medical director of that division and oversaw all the clinical research that we conducted with those technologies.
Okay, awesome. And where did you go from there? So after the Medtronic stuff?
So after that, I decided I wanted to pursue a career in the entrepreneurial environment. So I left Medtronic and I helped co-found a venture-backed medtech incubator called Protostar, in which New Enterprise Associates was the major investor, NEA. And during that time, I made some observations in a clinical environment, watching cases that led to the concept for a new implantable neuromodulation medical device to treat chronic cardiovascular diseases, initially high blood pressure and ultimately chronic heart failure. And so that concept became a company called CVRX. It was the first of 3 companies that spun out of the Protostar incubator, and I spun out as the founding CEO and ended up spending 17 years at CVRX working toward, moving this technology from concept through to commercialization. So I was the CEO for the first 6 years. I raised the first 3 rounds of capital, and then ultimately transitioned out of the CEO role, but stayed at the company for another 11 years, overseeing clinical research and reimbursement strategy and our intellectual property portfolio. So that was what I refer to as a 17-year sprint. It was 100% effort, every day. And I think that the company ultimately got PMA approval for the treatment of chronic heart failure. The company ended up going public shortly after I left. And so the end of the story hasn't been written yet, but hopefully we've been doing good things for patients. I actually had one of my most memorable opportunities in my career was we had an investigator meeting for a big heart failure study, and we invited to participate at the meeting one of the patients who had participated in our feasibility trial. And when I was introduced to this gentleman, I went to shake his hand, and he threw his arms around me and he said, "We've never met, but you saved my life." And it was a very tearful, emotional, moment for this gentleman who had been a professional skier and then was afflicted with the heart failure condition, was treated with our device and really, had a good outcome. And so
Wow.
I've carried that wonderful memory with me for all of these years.
Absolutely. So that's super cool. And when you can actually see the impact of the technology on patients, it must be it must be just so rewarding, especially when you spun it out from such an early stage and spotted that opportunity. So how did you spot that technology? Where did you find the idea for, well, it's become Barostim now, but where did you find the idea for the technology at CVRX? How did you even acquire it at Protostar?
Yeah, so we were out looking for unmet needs in medicine, and my focus was cardiovascular. We had somebody focused on orthopedics, somebody focused on interventional cardiology, and my focus was really chronic cardiovascular disease. And so I was talking to a lot of physicians. I was watching cases in ORs and cath labs. And, the Barostim technology is very straightforward, what we call system physiology, about how your blood pressure is regulated through your central nervous system and your heart and your kidneys and your blood vessels that dilate and constrict. And I was watching cases and I made observations during a case of a patient's blood pressure going down following an intervention. And I recognized, the physiology at work. And I thought, wow, if we could harness that, potentially we could have a meaningful kind of new treatment for these cardiovascular disorders. And so, with my background in active implantable devices, my mind took me toward a neuromodulation solution as opposed to a mechanical solution, and that's really where the idea was originated. And so, we developed crude prototypes and started testing them. We did some acute, human work, and things were looking positive, and that allowed us to raise successive rounds of capital and develop the product that became Barostim. And it was, there were a lot of lessons learned along the way. It was a very new approach, using medical devices in this way to treat these conditions. And so there was a lot of learning that went on, and lessons that I'm thinking about today, as we're embarking on the Arctx journey.
Absolutely. And we will dive into Arctx, but I think it's worth pushing on some of those lessons first. So across this journey with CVRx, I guess, what did you learn across the journey? What were the key things that you think that you've held on to? And yeah, give me some of the ideas behind why you've learned those lessons.
Yeah. So I think, some of the fundamental, I mean, maybe they're obvious in retrospect, but some of the fundamental things were, we were not a company where the chief marketing officer was employee number 2 or employee number 1, and that was really something in retrospect that I would do differently this time. Not necessarily a chief marketing officer, but we greatly underestimated the market development requirements that we needed to undertake to really make people aware of a new approach of treating high blood pressure and heart failure, educating the market about the unmet need, getting familiarity with the approach, and the evidence to, allow people to think about adopting a new therapy. And so, embarking on market development early, it was a hard lesson for us to learn, because it turned out that, we thought we were out there at conferences, we were getting our papers published. And then when we did surveys about, who's ever heard of this, it was amazing. The lack of visibility and the lack of recognition and the lack of familiarity and comfort. And so, so that was one lesson learned, was it's a lot more than just developing technology that works. And again, obvious in retrospect, probably.
So what was the, sorry to interrupt, what was the kind of effect of that? So did you kind of realize when you were doing those surveys that you weren't commercializing as quickly as you'd kind of planned? What was it that kind of was the knock-on effect of that lack of early market development work?
It was, this was all pre-commercial. So this was a PMA product, so it was a long development cycle. And really just, establishing clinical champions and creating a buzz and a pull, for this new approach, and credibility. And so, finding clinical champions, the right clinical champions, clinical investigators to, help drive robust enrollment in our clinical trials, and fundraising, as well, and having the investment community who turned to their clinical champions and said, "Hey, what do you think about this? Have you ever heard of this?" It was really that bootstrapping of all of those elements that really ended up being necessary, and I'm sure that continued throughout the commercial phase of the company as well. Yeah. So, and then related to that, particularly in the high blood pressure space, really the importance of a new technology fitting into established workflows, and putting technology into the hands of physicians who understand it, know how to use it, or want to use it, and can incorporate it into their day-to-day practice. Hypertension specialists, often nephrologists, but also others, mostly manage patients by prescribing medications and haven't historically used these types of medical devices in their day-to-day management of patients. And so, that was an additional burden to have to educate the physician community, have them acknowledge that there is a need for these new approaches, and then get them comfortable, being able to use them and prescribe them for their patients. So, less so in heart failure, but in hypertension, it was more of the departure from a day-to-day workflow for the treating physician. Heart failure physicians are much more technology comfortable and, incorporate technology into their practice on a much more regular basis. So when the company pivoted from a focus on hypertension to a focus on heart failure, that element was a little bit more straightforward. And then I would say that the third thing was, which we had the good fortune of doing successfully at CVRx, is we got started on reimbursement very early, and it really is a multi-year effort, particularly with new technologies that require new CP2 codes and new ICD-10 codes, and possibly new DRGs or additional DRG payments for inpatient procedures. Those things we had the foresight of, recognizing early that this was a lot of work to be done here, and I think it served the company really well to get started on the reimbursement strategy very early. So okay. I would say those are some of the key, looking back, some of the key lessons that I've taken with me.
I'm interrupting this episode to bring you a word from our sponsors, TTP. TTP is a leader in complex medical technology development with deep scientific and engineering expertise. They support ambitious medtech companies in solving high-risk, high-complexity challenges where there's no margin for error. Whether you're tackling uncharted technical territory or racing to bring a product to market, TTP provide clarity and direction. By de-risking innovation and ensuring seamless alignment with regulatory and manufacturing demands, TTP help you move forward with speed and confidence. To find out more, check out the show notes. Working on reimbursement, how early do you think is almost too early, or when is the right time to start focusing on that reimbursement for early medical device executives?
Well, I think that, I think it's a key question for investors. So, even when going out and raising your early rounds of capital, investors would want to know that there's an appreciation for what the reimbursement landscape is, what's going to be required, and a strategy. So I don't think it's ever too early to start thinking about at least understanding, that what's going to be needed and starting to create a strategy. In our case, we had to build relationships with Vascular Surgery Specialty Society to support our efforts to get new CPT codes here in the U.S. And, there was a certain amount of clinical evidence that we had to, establish before really being able to cultivate these champions and get the support of this subspecialty society. So you can't necessarily start on everything right away, but it's certainly, starting with recognizing a need, establishing a strategy, and beginning to build relationships with key influencers and decision makers and ultimate supporters and champions are things that really can and should get started on right away.
Very valuable advice. So CVRx, you were with for nearly 17 years altogether. That's a big chunk of your career to spend at one organization. What influenced the decision to move on? What were you looking for as your next move, and why were you looking to potentially move away from CVRx?
Well, it was it was a difficult decision, of course. This was sort of my baby, but after 17 years, it was no longer a baby, and it was no longer, mine, so to speak. And the company was maturing. It was, heading toward a commercial phase, hopefully. And it just seemed like, the right time to write the next chapter for me. I still had energy for new things. And I ended up actually, I did some consulting for a little while, and then I ended up on the service provider side of the industry for 5 or 6 years after that. So that was a whole new challenge of, helping companies that are developing products to get their products to market. And so I worked for a well-established R&D laboratory in Paris, France, for several years, and then we were ultimately acquired by a new U.S.-based organization focused on providing services to medtech companies largely. And so I was in a commercial role for that organization for 5 to 6 years, depending on whether it was pre or post the acquisition. And that was great. It was a whole new learning experience for me. I was actually the acting chief commercial officer for the company for a year, overseeing sales and marketing. It was a pretty large organization. We had acquired close to 13 companies over a 2-year period. And so we were integrating and growing, and it was we had probably close to 1,000 people at the time. So it was a pretty big undertaking. So that occupied, my energy for those 5 to 6 years. And then, I felt like it was, at that point in my career, I started thinking about getting back into the entrepreneurial environment more directly. I mean, I got exposed to all kinds of really cool technologies, and we worked on really important unmet needs, and helped out a lot of companies trying to bring these products and services forward. But at that point, I felt like I started to yearn to be back in the entrepreneurial environment myself, back in a leadership role, closer to innovation, closer to patient care. And it was about that time that I was introduced to Arctx. It's a young company that is only a few years old, that happened to be looking for a new CEO. And because of a couple of different elements, I really thought that this was the right next move for me. So in July of 2025, I finished up my role at my previous company, and after just a few days off, I started in the CEO role at Arctx. So I've been in the seat now since July, so just about 5 months. It's been a really steep learning curve for me, but super exciting, and really, I'm thrilled to be here. We're doing important work, and we have a lot of work in front of us, but at the end of the day, I think it's going to be really gratifying and really good for patients, and happy to tell you more about that.
Absolutely. So I'd love to tell the audience about what the technology actually does, and also about the patient impact. Let's talk through Arctx. What is Arctx? What is the technology, and how is it used in the clinical setting?
Yeah, perfect. So Arctx is technology that was conceived at Mayo Clinic, and it was out-licensed from Mayo, and the company was formed in 2021 and raised a Series A round of capital in 2022. And so we can talk more about that. But it is a technology to treat a condition called acute pancreatitis. So we're ultimately going to use the technology for a couple of different indications, but the primary focus has been the treatment of a disorder called acute pancreatitis. And as the name implies, acute pancreatitis is an acute inflammation and injury of your pancreas. So your pancreas is an abdominal organ, and it synthesizes digestive enzymes and insulin, so it plays a role in digestive health and endocrine health. But due to a variety of conditions, the pancreas can get acutely inflamed and injured. And this happens to about 300,000 patients in the U.S. per year that come down with this condition. It's about 10 times that worldwide on an annual basis. And some of the leading causes are gallstones, alcohol abuse. It can be caused by infection. It can be a complication of an endoscopic diagnostic procedure in the GI tract. But rapid weight loss is also a risk factor for acute pancreatitis. And so, as we've seen the rapid adoption of GLP-1 agonists for weight loss, we're watching closely for whether there is an association between GLP-1 agonist use and increasing incidence of acute pancreatitis, because it is rising. So there are these varieties of conditions that lead to this acute inflammation of the pancreas, and it is a high morbidity and potentially high mortality condition. It usually presents as a medical emergency. Patients have uncontrollable acute abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, inability to tolerate food, and often present to the emergency department, sometimes by ambulance, for this acute condition. And there are no approved treatments for acute pancreatitis. So there are no drugs that are targeted approved therapies for pancreatitis, and there are no medical devices. So treatment for these patients is limited to what we call supportive care: IV fluids, pain relief medication, nutritional support, if that can be tolerated, and time. And it largely is a waiting game until now. So what we have with Arctx is a minimally invasive device that is a simple solution that takes advantage of well-established principles of providing cooling therapy, cold or cooling therapy, in the presence of acute inflammation and injury, whether it's musculoskeletal with an ice pack, or post-cardiac arrest, or with post-central nervous system injury. Applying cold, it has been a well-established and successful first-line and straightforward treatment for a lot of these conditions. And it really helps to, reduce the inflammation and injury, prevent progression, and accelerate healing. And that is what we are now, we believe, able to do to treat acute pancreatitis. So what we do is we take advantage of the fact that in the abdomen, the stomach and the pancreas are very close together. And it's been demonstrated that if you can cool the contents and the lining of the stomach, that because of that proximity, that cold can actually penetrate across the wall of the stomach and directly cool the pancreas by a target of, say, 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. So this has been demonstrated in preclinical studies that if you cool the stomach contents, when you can cool the pancreas, and that can have favorable effects in at least experimental models of acute pancreatitis. And now we have human clinical data to support that as well. And so the Arctx product is a catheter, a long length catheter, if I can, that gets introduced into the nasal cavity and threaded down through your esophagus into your stomach. And this somewhat long length of catheter gets coiled in the stomach, and there's a closed circuit within this catheter through which we simply circulate ice cold water. So the other end of the catheter gets connected to a console that can pump ice cold water through the catheter. It stays inside the catheter. It doesn't leave the catheter. And that has been demonstrated in our own clinical experience now, has shown that we can rapidly cool the contents of the stomach to about 24 degrees Celsius from 37. And that, is intended to have that cold move over to the pancreas and treat the acute inflammatory condition of the pancreas in a selective and minimally invasive non-surgical manner. So it's elegant in its simplicity, and could, we believe, become a new first-line therapy for this disease, regardless of the ultimate severity of the condition in patients. Because when patients show up in the emergency room, you don't know how severe or not severe their condition is ultimately going to be. And it could be fatal in up to 30% of patients. Patients who
Wow.
have something called severe necrotizing pancreatitis can be, have a high mortality. So patients can be in the hospital for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, depending on the severity of their condition. This really leads to more than 1 million patient hospitalization days per year in the United States. And so it's a condition that before now hasn't really had a lot of new treatment options. It costs about $3 billion per year in the United States to care for these patients. And now we think we have what could be a new standard of care, so that when patients come to the emergency room, they get they get diagnosed as having acute pancreatitis because of their clinical signs and some blood tests and some imaging that they can do. And as soon as they get their IV placed and get their pain relief medications, we believe that a reasonable next step could be for them to receive the Arctx Cool catheter. And this is a device that is a non-sterile class 2 medical device that can be put in at the bedside without anesthesia, without imaging, by a physician or a nurse. And so it's a very straightforward approach, and we can begin providing cooling therapy immediately. And when that patient is stabilized and admitted and transferred upstairs, that the therapy can accompany the patient upstairs. Some patients go to the GI ward, some patients go to the ICU, depending on the severity of their condition. And our therapy is intended to be able to be provided for up to 72 hours. Which in the preclinical studies seem to be a reasonable window, and seems to be, in our human clinical experience, well tolerated by patients. And in our first in human study, which was a study done in 21 patients with acute pancreatitis, the results of which were recently published at a major GI conference as a late-breaking clinical trial. We had what we believed, was a favorable safety profile, a high 100% technical success rate of placing the catheter, removing the catheter, and with the clinical data that we collected, we saw what we believe are signals of possible therapeutic efficacy. Now, did not have a control group in that study to compare it against. So, we still need to determine in a randomized controlled clinical trial, how much of patient improvement is attributable to being treated with the Arctx device. And we have plans to do that in early 2026. But the initial results from the first in human study were very encouraging to us. So that was presented orally at the American College of Gastroenterology conference in October, and we're now writing this up in a manuscript format for peer review publication.
Awesome. So I'm just going to go back to that mortality side of it. In acute pancreatitis, what actually causes that mortality? Like, is it the pancreas shutting down? What is it that causes it?
Yeah. So the not all of pancreatitis has a 30% mortality rate. There are many cases that are more mild, where the mortality rate could be 5%, or something lower than 30%. But in these severe necrotizing cases, it could be upwards of 30%. And what happens is that a couple of different things can happen. Toxic metabolites can build up in the pancreas and get released into the bloodstream, and can adversely affect renal function, kidney function, heart function, pulmonary function, and those additional organ injuries can contribute to patient demise. I mentioned digestive enzymes; those things can actually leak into the abdomen and cause additional problems directly for the abdominal organs. is my understanding. And so for a variety of ways that acute pancreatitis can lead to multi-system dysfunction and disorder and organ failure, that is one of the mechanisms by which this can be a fatal condition. And of course, if it's an infectious pancreatitis, then sepsis, could be a potential complication of that as well.
Got you. Understood. Yeah, just wanted to try and figure that one out. So just to move back onto the trial. So you've got good clinical results. It shows the procedure is safe, is that there is technical success, but you've got to do this randomized control before you can fully make claims that you probably have a good feeling about. So how are you designing that next trial, the randomized trial to prove the results? How are you setting that one up?
Yeah. So, so obviously because the device isn't FDA cleared yet, so this is going to be a de novo regulatory pathway for an FDA marketing authorization. So because it's not cleared yet, we can't make claims about safety or efficacy. So we're being very cautious about that, even though we're encouraged by the first in human data that we have. But we are now what we call IDE approved. So when you want to do a clinical trial in the United States, you have to get FDA approval if it's a pre-market device under something called investigational device exemption, or IDE. And Arctx has secured IDE approval to conduct an approximately 200 patient prospective randomized controlled clinical trial in patients with acute pancreatitis at up to 25 sites in the United States. So that trial is largely organized and defined. It's about 200 or 210 patients randomized equally to receive Arctx therapy on top of standard of care medical therapy versus receiving standard of care medical therapy alone. We'll treat patients for up to 72 hours, follow their clinical course for safety for up to 30 days. But the primary efficacy endpoint is a surrogate for length of hospital stay. So reducing patient length of hospital stay is an important goal for these treatments. It's better for them clinically to be released from to be able to get better, to be released from the hospital more quickly and be out of the hospital more quickly. And it's also economically very advantageous for hospitals, for patients to get released sooner. So reducing length of stay is an important clinical and economic endpoint and outcome. And that's, what we think is one of the promises of Arctx, that we can limit the advancement of the disease, allow patients to have a milder clinical course, get better sooner, and be released more quickly. The issue that we face at a practical level is that although patients may be well enough to be released from the hospital, they're not always released from the hospital in an efficient manner. Things like the weekend sometimes interfere with a patient being released from the hospital in a timely manner. If a patient has gallstones, maybe they stay in the hospital and have their gallstones removed surgically, which would prolong their length of stay. So just looking at length of stay by itself is a sort of a confounded endpoint. But what we do know is that the most important, in my understanding, clinical trigger for patients to be able to be released from the hospital is their ability to tolerate food without the recurrence or worsening of their abdominal pain and nausea and vomiting. And that in terms of clinical decision making, that's a really important element of a patient being indicated for discharge. So we're looking very closely for our primary endpoint at an ability of the patient to tolerate solid food, but also additional objective physiologic criteria that they don't have other indications of systemic inflammatory response or other indications of renal, cardiovascular, or pulmonary dysfunction. So that's the composite primary endpoint that we're looking at. which is directly related to length of stay, and I think is going to be a little bit more robust clinical measure to compare the treatment group versus the control group. So that's the study design.
Another quick interruption to tell you about our sponsors, KUKA. KUKA is a global leader in robotics with over 25 years of experience partnering with medtech companies on their journey to market. Their reputation is built on robust technology, reliability, and long-term collaboration. More than a supplier, KUKA provides trusted support throughout the product lifecycle, from development to integration and beyond. For companies exploring robotic solutions, the KUKA LBR Med offers a ready-to-integrate, state-of-the-art option that meets the highest medical standards, without the need to build from scratch. If you want to find out more, then head to the show notes and follow the link to KUKA's website. At the minute, so how are caregivers kind of reacting to this technology? And the reason why I'm asking that is because it's new, it's novel. There's not many treatment options available at the moment apart from manage with painkillers and IVD. So is it a case of skepticism because this is brand new and there's a new piece and no one's really been able to solve this problem before? Or is it more like, yes, we really need to get this into the hospitals because, yeah, obviously this gives us a treatment option where none currently exists?
Yeah, well, we have been successful. And by the way, I just want to emphasize a lot of this work predated me. So I've only been here since July, and a lot of this really great work, it is, although I'm talking about it, was done by the excellent team that we have, and I just want to be very clear about that. And that's one of the reasons why I got so excited about coming to Arctx, was about all the progress that the company has made. So we have attracted a really great medical advisory board, some of the real thought leaders in the pancreas space. And as I mentioned, our first in human data was accepted as a late breaking oral presentation during this major gastroenterology conference. So I think certainly by clinical thought leaders in the space, there's a recognition that there has been no really advancement in the treatment of this disease in decades. The incidence and prevalence are growing, and it's frustrating for doctors to not have more tools available to them. So the receptivity has been good. In addition to that, the principles of cooling, are well established. So that's not a far-flung, really hypothesis that this could potentially help acute pancreatitis. And there's preclinical data and now human clinical data to support that. And, it's not an implantable device. It's not a surgical approach. We believe is going to turn out to be a very straightforward and safe procedure, easy to adopt, straightforward for doctors or nurses to put in right at the patient bedside. So, we are in the early stages of engaging hospitals across the country in a dialogue about participation in our clinical trial. And so far, we've been, encouraged by the response.
Okay, amazing stuff. Amazing stuff. So, how's it felt to join this team? So you stepped into a team after it's been founded and you're joining them on this journey in the last 6 months. How have you found it working with the technology spun out from Mayo Clinic and also all of the guys who you've joined?
Yeah, so I was FTE number 5 in the company. I'm here in Minnesota, which is really a prominent geographic center in the U.S. for medtech product development and commercialization. The rest of the team is in Northern California. And so we're working remotely most of the time together. But, it's a team of people who have worked together very successfully over a number of previous companies that have gone on to have successful exit or IPO. So really a kind of a proven team that works well together. There's a high level of trust and a lot of candor, within the team. And that was really reassuring, to me coming in, and I have worked really hard to build up their trust in me, and confidence that I was the right person to join the team and help to lead the company moving forward. So it's been a great experience so far. Our executive chairman is a gentleman named Steve Bassich, who's a very successful serial entrepreneur. Don Gerskis is the co-founding CEO who has remained on as CTO. And we have several other talented engineering and clinical people. So it's been a great start. As I mentioned, there was a Series A raise in 2022. We have some bridge financing in place right now, and the major goal and my priority right now is to raise a Series B round of capital to finance the pivotal trial and some additional milestones for the company. So that's a major focus for me, and that's what occupies the vast majority of my time. Our board and investor syndicate, also a real strength, and they've been super supportive and helpful in the process as well. So the Series A round was led by SHD and Andrew Offer, who's based in Dallas. Mayo participated. Kelly Kreinig is on the board from Mayo, and Solus Bioventures with David Adair. These are the current investors and board members, aside from Steve and myself, and they've just been really part of the positive experience that I've had here, and part of the confidence that I had to come over to Arctx. So it's been great. And we have some work to do to bring in the financing, but we're getting some traction and we're making progress, and we're optimistic.
Excellent. And how are you finding fundraising in the current funding environment? Is it harder than it was previous in other ventures, or is this kind of just a standard market?
I would say it's a challenging market. And it's been a difficult couple of years for venture-backed medtech companies. A lot of it was incited by the pandemic initially, where investors were really safeguarding their capital and their dry powder for their existing investments, and not making as many new investments. So I think that's and there wasn't a very robust IPO market during that time. So we believe that ultimately the trend is going to be improving, but it's in my experience and talking to my peers who are out trying to raise money, it is a challenge, and investors are still cautious with regard to funding new investments, and we're talking to venture capitalists, we're talking to strategics, we're talking to family offices. And so we're trying to be thoughtful, and others, about possible sources of capital, and seeing where we could be successful.
Understood. So just to kind of finish up with Arctx then, so is there anything you want the audience to know about Arctx, what's coming up, or anything we haven't covered yet? What's anything you want to add?
Yeah, so there's one other dimension which we haven't talked about, which could prove to be quite exciting and valuable for the company as well. So the major indication for Arctx technology is the treatment for acute pancreatitis, which is going to go through this de novo pathway and a randomized controlled clinical trial. Separately, and in addition to that, the technology can be used for general body temperature management indications. Patients who have need for cooling or need for warming, we're finding that the technology can be used for those as well. Neurogenic fevers, other types of conditions where patients might have uncontrolled elevation of body temperature, for example. There is an established patient cooling market. There are external devices, pads and blankets that circulate cold water. There are also internal cooling devices when more aggressive cooling is needed, or patients, for example, burn victims can't tolerate the external products. Those products today might require anesthesia, might require endovascular intervention. And what we have with Arctx is a new approach to patient cooling and possibly warming that doesn't require anesthesia, doesn't require endovascular intervention. And the company had the very good fortune of receiving at the end of October 510K clearance marketing authorization from the FDA to use this technology for general temperature management purposes. And so, that we believe, that's is a vote of confidence in the technology. It has opened the door to conversations with industry players who are in the temperature management space, who might want to be in the temperature management space. And it was just another great milestone and value driver for the company to have secured this actual marketing authorization. So we are still thinking through how best to leverage this new marketing authorization and figure out who are the right industry players who we really need to be talking to about this, and are there partnerships that are possible, around this technology with this indication. This is all very new for us, and we're just really trying to think through it and see where these conversations lead.
Understood. Have you got a good idea of what the total addressable market might be for the cooling and warming side of this?
So I've seen data that suggests that the cooling market is $300 to $500 million in the United States. I don't want to state that overly categorically because this is still something that we are learning a lot about. But this is, I believe, around the scope of what we may be talking about here.
Understood. But the acute pancreatitis seems like a much larger market. And
yeah, it's about a $3 billion annual healthcare spend in the US alone. So worldwide, much more significant than that.
Understood. Well, thank you very much for sharing the story up till this point. There's one final thing that I wanted to ask about, which was when we was doing the research for this episode. You found yourself in front of Congress when you were CEO at CVRx. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that and how that came about and what that really meant?
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. So I've spent a lot of time during my career involved in advocacy work for the medical device industry. And so there's a local organization here called the Medical Alley Association of Minnesota that I was on the board of for, I think, 9 or 10 years. I was actually the board chairperson for a number of years. And I was also about 10 years on the board of the Medical Device Manufacturers Association based in Washington, D.C., which is a national organization. And we would regularly, come to Washington, D.C. to meet with, Congress and staffers, senators, representatives, and staffers to talk about issues, facing the industry and possible solutions. So you may recall, or you may have heard that a number of years ago there was a medical device tax that was instituted and talked about. There was intellectual property reform. There was industry user fees negotiated with the FDA. So there were a number of issues over the years that were important to the medical device industry. And so as a part of my tenure on the board of these organizations, I would participate in these congressional fly-ins and other meetings, and actually had the opportunity to testify on behalf of the industry in front of Congress about some of these issues in different forums. So some of them were large committee meetings, some of them were staffing meetings, or field congressional hearings. But yeah, it was important work that we believe we were doing good, on behalf of the industry and on behalf of the patients that we serve, and it was a wonderful experience. And I was grateful to our government leaders for the opportunity to have those conversations and work with them to make improvements. And I do also want to say that when we got the 510K clearance letter from FDA, we got that letter 9:00 at night in the middle of a U.S. government shutdown. And so the FDA was hard at work, making sure that these new innovations were moving forward, and we're totally grateful, about that. So, long story short, that was my opportunity to play a role on behalf of the industry in these advocacy efforts.
Amazing. Well, Rob, thank you very much for joining me on here. Is there anything else you want to leave the audience with, a final closing statement at all?
Well, what we like to say at Arctx is cool is the new hot. So stay tuned. We have exciting, things that we're doing, and hopefully some very exciting new developments coming soon, and some new treatment options for patients in need. So Henry, thanks to you and to Crux for having me on, and it's really been a pleasure. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you so much. I had a lot of fun. Thank you so much for joining me on the Crux of MedTech podcast. If you're not already doing so, please go ahead and subscribe on YouTube or follow the podcast on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is proudly brought to you by Crux. Crux is a medtech search firm which places pioneers in transformative roles to help us live longer, healthier lives. We do 3 things for companies. We help hire world-class executive talent. We help companies raise investment from Series A to Series C and execute upon M&A. And we also are building a community of medtech leaders to facilitate peer-to-peer learning and accelerate the companies to help them go faster. If you're interested in any of those 3 things, please reach out to me on LinkedIn or follow the link in the show notes to find out more. Thank you.